welcome to this session on inclusion versus exclusion for SEND pupils. So my name's Ellen Wilkinson, in-year fair access and exclusions manager for Derby City Council. I started in this role last September, and I've been invited today to present sort of basically what my role is and share what I've been doing around in-year fair access and exclusions for SEND children and young people since September. So a lot of this presentation is data, and data on exclusions and breaking that down into different categories. I thought it'd be a good opportunity to explain what the behaviour strategies are across primary and secondary, and I apologise, I don't know which phase you're from, so I've covered both primary and secondary. There's a small section on reduced timetables and a piece of work that I've been doing around children and young people who are on a reduced timetable and the impact that has when they move from primary to secondary. And then looking at the strategies and interventions that schools use and how we as an in-year fair access and exclusions team work with schools and parents and other professionals to try and support that child or young person with SEND needs to prevent any further exclusions. So just a little bit of background on me. I previously worked at Bemrose School for 17 years, nearly 18 years. So I've been in Derby a long time, and coming straight from a secondary school, although Bemrose isn't all through school. So I've got some primary experience. I've mainly got secondary experience, but knowing Derby, knowing the schools, knowing the colleagues in the schools, I feel that you know, I'm working well with schools in terms of helping children and young people. So in-year fair access and exclusions sits within the PACE team, the education and skills team. That's Joe Ward's team. So I sit alongside Graham Ferguson and the virtual school and the other PACE members, and we sort of all work together within that team. In terms of the title of the presentation today, I wasn't quite sure what to call it because I didn't want to just call it exclusion data. So although there is a lot of data, I did want to put the spin on inclusion. And listening to the conference so far today, it's really clear that, you know, obviously we want inclusion high on that priority list in schools, and schools are becoming more inclusive and are working together for children with SEND. And if we can be inclusive, then obviously for me, in terms of reducing exclusions, that's really good. Okay, so starting to look at Derby context and looking at permanent exclusions. So like Wendy said, I'll pause after each section, and if anybody's got any questions, then please let me know. So permanent exclusion figures. Over the last 2 years, as you're well aware, that they're not normal years. So if I start with this current year, so far up until May half term, we've had 4 permanent exclusions in primary. 2 of those children are SEND, one has an education healthcare plan, one SEND support. So in terms of looking at analysis there, the figures are very, very small. Last year, up until March 2020, 18 permanent exclusions, 15 of which were SEND children, and as you can see the figures there. So the last full year was 2018-2019, and as you can see, permanent exclusions have reduced dramatically. Some of that is due to school closures, and some of that is due to COVID, but more is to do with the collaboration around working together and doing the best for the child. In terms of secondary, permanent exclusions, again, 2020-2021 up until May half term, 4 permanent exclusions have been issued, 2 of which are SEND, 2 young people, should I say. 2 young people have got an education and healthcare plan. But then looking back on the figures last year, 38 permanent exclusions issued until March. no young people with an education healthcare plan, but 10 with SEND support. Last full year of normal school, 64. So the number of permanent exclusions were extremely high in Derby City, and at this point, the behaviour strategy was introduced to try and reduce permanent exclusions across the city, and I'll share more on that in a few slides. In terms of, I'm just going to go back a slide, just back to primary. In terms of the process when a child is permanently excluded, I just thought I'd touch on that because sometimes schools are not sure what happens to that young person. Usually in primary, a child is permanently excluded for damage or for hurting others. Usually, not always. Usually hurting an adult. And what happens when that child is permanently excluded? From day 6, the local authority have a responsibility to pick up the education for that child. And if they're a Derby resident, then they would go to Newton's Walk, and Newton's Walk would pick up their education for the child. In terms of my role in EFR Access, we've got the at-risk register in primary, which if you're a primary colleague, I'm sure you're aware of, and all schools have a responsibility to complete the at-risk register and share the children who are most at risk in their school. So generally, as a local authority, we know the children that are green, amber and red on the at-risk register, and if a permanent exclusion is issued, there's generally been lots of conversation, and there definitely has, about those 4 children this year. I can't comment for previous years because I wasn't in post. But yeah, the conversations are around those children and trying to prevent that permanent exclusion, but sometimes the behaviour is so challenging that schools have to decide if the child is breaching their behaviour policy, and by having that child remain at their school, it would seriously harm the educational welfare of other children or adults in their school. So at that point, that child does move on to Newton's Walk. Some children at Newton's Walk come back into the system and come back into mainstream school, and they come back through primary placement panel. Primary placement panel meets once every fortnight. I chair that panel, and there's representatives from primary schools, so head teachers. There's representatives from admissions. Jonathan Howie from Early Help, Deputy Head of Service, he attends, and Newton's Walk staff. So we have a fair representation of professionals to be able to make the decision of whether that child is ready to be integrated back into mainstream school. In secondary, the process is similar. So again, head teachers have that right to permanently exclude, but generally these 4 exclusions here, conversations have been had with the local authority in terms of whether that decision is right for their school and right for that young person. The young people in secondary, again, local authority has a responsibility to pick up day 6 provision, so that child would go to Kingsmead School. And again, if a child or young person is permanently excluded, they go to Kingsmead for day 6 provision. They then go on to a pathway 1, 2 or 3. Some young people are turned around very quickly and gone back into a mainstream school. Some young people have an assessment period where their needs are looked at, some intensive strategies, intensive therapy happens, and they, after a short period of time, would then come back into mainstream, or some young people stay in alternative provision in the PRU for the rest of their education. That system is managed through secondary placement panel, and again I chair that panel, and again similar representation is on the panel, and we will look at each individual child and bring them back into mainstream settings as and when they are ready and they are likely to be successful. Any questions around permanent exclusions?
Hi, Ellen. Yes, there's one question. How do those figures compare to Derbyshire?
I don't know the answer to that, but because Derbyshire is obviously a lot bigger county, I'd need to look at it in terms of percentages. And Derbyshire is broken down into areas as well, so it's easier to compare it city to another city who is a similar size to us, and that's a really good question, and I haven't done that, but I will look into that and do that for the end of year comparison.
Okay.
Because what I do is analyse the data every half term. So when we get to the summer, that'll be really good for me to look at in terms of, I've got in my head Coventry as being a similar size to us. I might be totally wrong there, but that's something that I will do.
Okay.
Thank you.
And for one here from Deb Robinson, what impact has COVID and school lockdowns had on exclusions in primary and secondary?
I'll come on to that in a second, because I think in terms of, I'm just about to go into fixed term exclusions now.
Okay.
I think there's more of an impact there. I think because the numbers are so small in terms of permanent exclusions, it's difficult to comment, but we'll come on to that in a second.
Okay, thank you. And that's the questions in the Q&A so far.
Thank you. Okay, so looking at primary data, so these are fixed term exclusions. So these could be for a half day, a lunchtime, 1 day, 5 day, a short period of time, and then the child comes back into school. So so far this year, up until May, 111 exclusions have been issued. That's exclusions, not individuals. So some individuals will have had repeat exclusions there. Last year, 134, and then you can obviously see the figures from the previous years, which were full school years. In fact, the number of weeks here are very, very similar. So I think it's 24 weeks we'd had up until May half term, and there were 24 weeks ish up until March last year, although the timings of the weeks were obviously very different, with our school closure being January to March. But in terms of SEND children, 51% of those fixed term exclusions are from SEND children, and you can see the figures there of 18 exclusions from children with a plan, and 39 exclusions for children from children with SEND support. The reason I've just put little markers here is last year the data was collected by Synergy, which is the system that the local authority use, and within Synergy there's a lot of children whose SEND details are they're unknown. This year I've kept my own data because I'm new to role, and I wanted to collect all the data from the schools, and obviously I've got the Synergy data too, and historically Chris Orme collected this data, so again we've got actual data from schools, but for this year 1920 it is purely just Synergy data, so I am not sure how accurate that 34% is there, especially with 67%, 61 and 51% of all exclusions from SEND children being high, and that's a lot lower. So I am guessing that 55 unknown, there are a lot of children who are SEND in that figure there. So what I've done is worked out the average number of exclusions per week. And like I said, there was about 24 school weeks so far this year and 24 school weeks last year. And as you can see, the number of exclusions issued has reduced over the years. And it's about 4.6, so I've rounded that up to 5. And in answer to the question earlier around COVID, I think clearly the data is showing that there have been less exclusions, but is that because children have not been in school as much? So the exclusions that were issued in the autumn term and since March, is that some that are not in school? I think definitely in the autumn term a lot of children were self-isolating, and consistent attendance may not have been as normal as it normally would, but since March attendance is obviously better, but the figures are still lower, so whether COVID has had an impact on that, I don't know. In terms of them, I've broken down for some analysis just for primary. So we're just staying with primary for this for a second. I haven't done any analysis in terms of schools. I know the analysis in terms of schools, but I've not shared that with you today. Broken it down to year groups, so you can see that year 6, I've got a high number of exclusions. So the blue is the exclusions, the orange is the individuals. So as you can see in year 6, there's a lot of individuals that have had repeat exclusions, and I'll come back to year 6 in a second. Very small numbers further down the school. Year 2 is quite high, but that there's one, because the figures are fairly small, and there's one child who's had a high number of repeat exclusions, and that's had an impact on that figure there. But year 6 is where we are doing some additional work around transition, because those children are moving on to secondary in September. We've got Paul Allen, who works for Kingsmead School. He's doing some additional transition work with 31 identified children from Newton's Walk and from mainstream schools. And those children that are in that orange category there are definitely involved in the work that Paul is doing, and aiding that transition between primary and secondary, and trying to build relationships early, because obviously they won't have their common transfer days, but hopefully they will have visits, and I know that he is planning visits with them on a one-to-one basis over the next 4 weeks. Looking at the reasons for exclusions in primary, the biggest category here is physical assault against an adult. 31 exclusions, they're not percentages, they're 31 exclusions out of the 111. And when you couple that together with physical assault against a pupil, that assault is over half of all exclusions, whether it's against a child or an adult. So and we'll come on to the behaviour strategy in a second. This forms a lot of the work that's gone into the primary behaviour strategy this year, in terms of the training offered, and looking at de-escalation, and looking at upskilling schools in terms of being able to offer other interventions and strategies for children to try and prevent their behaviour escalating to hurt others. I haven't got the figures on here, but looking at the physical assault against the adult, 48% of those exclusions there, so nearly half of those exclusions, are from children with SEND, and the persistent disruptive behaviour, which is the grey box here, about half of those exclusions are children with SEND as well, which is comparative to the whole figures. Okay, so just showing there the children with SEND. We've got 72 individuals out of the 111 exclusions. Children with a plan, education healthcare plan, very few have repeat exclusions. It is more children with SEND-K. But what we can do, because the figures are quite small, is our team, there's also Michelle Wolverson and myself, we will work with schools, we'll talk to schools and work. Michelle generally works with the parents, and the parents will generally contact Michelle, and we'll have conversations around how we can try and prevent those exclusions from repeating and escalating into permanent exclusion. Any questions on primary data?
Hi, Ellen. There's just one new question. Is there any data for what happens to these pupils who have been excluded in terms of aspirations and further education?
The ones that the fixed term or the permanent, because the fixed term exclusions, the child comes back into the school, and and I'll talk about reintegration further on, but they're obviously still in their school. But the permanent exclusions, we can track where those children go to. So in terms of a child that's permanently excluded in primary, they can then, when it comes to secondary transition, they can go back into a mainstream school even though they've had a permanent exclusion in primary. It's almost as though the slate's wiped clean, and they start again. We're totally aware that those children can be very challenging, and that's where that extra transition work comes in. And those children who are identified as red on the at-risk register, or they're at Newton's Walk, then that's where, as part of in Year Fair Access, we will work with those children and support them through into their secondary school, and then we track them then going through into secondary too. Hope that answers that.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so moving on to secondary, and again, just breaking down into the same system there. There's been 933 exclusions issued up until May, and as you can see, that's a reduction from last year, and then a huge reduction, less number of weeks, I totally appreciate, from the year before. So focusing on SEND, 323 exclusions were SEND, 57 with children with a plan, and 266 for SEND support. Again, those figures are from Synergy, so it's really tricky to find out how accurate that information is. But 35% is obviously higher than 31, but a lot lower than the primary figure of 51%. Breaking it down as the average number of exclusions per week, so there's 39 on average, 39 exclusions per week so far this year, 61 on average last year and 66 the year before. So the number of exclusions issued are lower this year, and again, I'd like to think that some of that is to do with COVID, but I'd like to think that more of it is because schools are more inclusive. Schools don't want to be excluding children. Children have been out of school for so much time over the last 18 months that actually they want children and young people in school, and are looking at using, definitely in secondary, have alternatives like isolation rooms, where they would use those instead of excluding the child for a day or half a day. But obviously for some incidents, then exclusions do need to be issued. Looking at year groups in terms of secondary, I've not focused on post-16, but there are a very small number in post-16. Year 9 is the highest year group with exclusions. Blue is exclusions, orange is individuals again, and a lot of repeat exclusions in year 8 and year 9. What I started to do this year as well is look at the year 7 exclusions and whether they were identified as red on the at-risk register. So looking at patterns from last year and how they found transition so that we could inform that for this year. And again, I will be looking at that for the children that Paul's working with in year 6, going through to year 7, if they have an exclusion issued in secondary in year 7, and looking at how they're settling and trying to prevent that from going forward. In terms of reasons for secondary, the biggest category for reasons is the brown one there. The brown one is physical assault against a pupil, fighting generally. It's about a third, as you can see, and it's about a third for persistent disruptive behaviour, which isn't a massive category in primary. In terms of physical assault against a pupil, I've broken that down into SEND, and it's about 30% of exclusions are SEND children, which is relative to the number of exclusions that SEND children have overall. And again, with persistent disruptive behaviour, it's about a third from SEND children too. Over this year, some of the codes have changed. So the top code there, abuse against sexual orientation and gender identity, that wasn't in existence this time last year. So the DFE have added new codes. They've reduced other, although I still do have other on here because we've got part of the year for other and part of the year for the new codes. Inappropriate use of social media and online technology is a new one. Willful and repeated transgression of protective measures in place to protect public health, which is the breaking the COVID bubbles and putting other children and young people and adults at risk because of their behaviour around health and safety is a new one too. So to be able to analyse the smaller groups there, that's something that we'll be able to do next year, but because of the introduction this year. And then just breaking that down into SEND, and again in terms of secondary, as you can see, 35 young people with an education and healthcare plan have had a fixed term exclusion, half a day through to 15 days, and 57 exclusions. So very few repeated exclusions there. Sorry, very few repeated individuals, usually one exclusion from children with a plan. It's just a very small number that have had repeat. However, the number of young people who are on SEND support have had a high number of repeat exclusions, and they are the young people that again we're working with to try and prevent any further exclusions that may then lead on to permanent exclusion. Okay, any questions about secondary data?
Just the one question. Is there an impact or penalty for the secondary school for short-term and permanent exclusions?
There's no penalty for fixed term exclusions. There's a financial penalty for both primary and secondary for permanent exclusions. For secondary, if a school permanently excludes a young person, it's £15,000 a year, which if a young person is in year 7, you can imagine is an awful lot of money. And that's quite a good question, because it brings us on to the behaviour strategy in a second. And one of the reasons of the purpose of the behaviour strategy was to reduce permanent exclusions, which I'll come on to a second. The financial penalty for primary schools depends. Local authority schools, it's £2,000, and for academies it's £5,000. And the difference there is because local authorities schools pay into in-year fair access contributions, therefore reducing their figure of what they have to pay, and academies don't at the moment. But because I'm new to post and we're looking at the protocol, which I'll come on to in a second with primary, things may shift around that, but there's some plans in place for that. Any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a behaviour strategy across primary and secondary. And I'll start with secondary, even though I've done primary then secondary, but I'll start with secondary first. So the purpose of both strategies really is to reduce exclusions. You can see back to 1819 that exclusions, both fixed term and permanent exclusions, were extremely high in Derby City, and we needed to do something different. I was involved in the secondary behaviour strategy working group as a deputy head teacher whilst I was at Bemrose, so I am aware of the planning that took place around the Fresh Start and the Fresh Start Plus processes, which I'll explain in a second. But now in post as in year fair access and exclusions manager, I do work alongside Karen Hayes from DPA, Derby Pride Academy, and we manage both of those two processes and those systems. So the strategy was, like I say, to reduce exclusions, but to create inclusivity, to aid secondary schools working together, to increase transparency, to support each other, and to prevent, to give young people a fresh start, basically, as it says on the tin, a fresh start in another mainstream setting. So the Fresh Start process is very similar to the Managed Move system. So it's a young person who needs a fresh start in another mainstream school. That process is managed through behaviour leads, and the behaviour leads are assistant head teachers, deputy head teachers in the 16 secondary schools. We've had 8 young people go through the fresh start process this year. One of those individuals has had 8 fixed term exclusions in the autumn term from one of the city schools. The school presented her as a fresh start back in December. So she'd had 8 fixed terms in September, October, November. Presented her a fresh start panel. It's a panel of all the behaviour leads, and the other 15 schools decide whether the young person should be a fresh start, whether the school has done enough to support that young person. And one of the other schools said, yeah, we'll give her a go. She can come and join our school. So she's dual registered at the moment between the 2 schools. The school have done a fantastic job with her. She's had no further fixed term exclusions, and she is successful in her school. And hopefully, fingers crossed, she will due to be signed off, and she will move on to the role of her new school, ready for September and when she moves into year 10. So that's how the fresh start process works. If that process broke down and that young person, the placement broke down for that young person, they would go back to their original school. And again, in Year Fair Access would support with that and see how we can maintain that placement back in their school. A Fresh Start Plus is for a young person who is at serious risk of permanent exclusion. So it's at a much higher level than a young person presented at Fresh Start. And it's a process where a school can think about whether historically the school would have probably permanently excluded the child because there weren't any other alternatives, but now they can think, actually, I will present this child as a Fresh Start Plus. I'll see if we have done enough to try and support that child all the way through. And sometimes other schools will challenge back and say, well, actually, have you tried X, Y, and Z? And the referring school will take the young person back and try those strategies. But generally, schools, we know schools do an awful lot to try and keep their young people in their schools. So we've had 11 referrals through the Fresh Start Plus process this year. And again, some are in mainstream schools, some have not quite got that far through other reasons, and it's sometimes due to parental consenting to the process but then withdrawing afterwards. So there's been some teething problems with some of the referrals, but the successful referrals, we've got 2 young people in new settings. Those young people would have been permanently excluded. Historically, they are successful, they're thriving, they are dual registered again until both schools agree that the young person will move on to the new school's role. And it's definitely had an impact on reducing the figures across the city. Sorry. In terms of the intervention catalogue, that's used alongside the Fresh Start and the Fresh Start Plus processes. The intervention catalogue is a central catalogue, a central database of all of the support agencies, services, professionals that are out there that we know of, all together in one place into different categories under mental health, under behaviour, under alternative provision. So when we've got these very difficult young people moving from school to school, or presented as a Fresh Start or Fresh Start Plus, and the school's challenging back and saying, have you tried referring to, I'm just trying to think of an example, Build Sound Minds, have you referred to the educated psychologist, have you referred to Yippee App? There are lots of different interventions out there through the catalogue that schools can look at and try and find that piece of that jigsaw that will keep that child in the mainstream school. Because at the end of the day, the relationships between the schools and the young person and the families are really, really important, and the original school is where they know that individual the best, they know that child the best, and if we can try and maintain them in that school, then that's fantastic. If that can't happen, then obviously all of that information is passed on to their new school, and the two schools work together in that new setting. So the behaviour strategy in terms of secondary is very much process driven through Fresh Start Plus. In terms of primary, this started last academic year, but was affected by COVID. The progress that it made, was affected by COVID. So Jane Green and I picked that back up in September. Again, we've got a working group of a number of head teachers and principals that sit around the virtual table, and in September, October time, we thought, right, okay, what are we going to do in terms of the behaviour strategy for primary? So we developed a sort of a 3-stage plan. For stage 1 being introducing a summer term training program, which is currently underway. And the basis of the summer training programme, just linking back to the fixed term exclusions for primary and the high number of physical assaults on an adult, is where we wanted to really target what training can we offer for free to all schools virtually, so that schools can take things away immediately. We're not in 1 hour, we're not going to be able to solve everything, but we can give an introduction to a particular intervention, to a particular strategy that another city school might use, that might be useful, where a practitioner can go back into school tomorrow and tweak, change, offer something to a child that might just make a difference in terms of helping them with their behaviour. So the summer training programme is every Wednesday. I'm just running my notes. It happens every Wednesday, 3 till 4. It's online. We've had over 400 people sign up for training. Some people attend every Wednesday. Some people have attended 2 or 3 sessions. It's generally teaching assistants, classroom teachers, Senkos, some head teachers, all from the primary phase, and each week there's probably 60-70 people in attendance in the training. The different themes of the training: there's been a de-escalation session delivered by Leah at Newton's Walk. We've had an ACEs session from Helen Smith at Chad Park. We've had an introduction to the Thrive approach from Manny at Lakeside. We've had the STEPS team delivering a session on working with EPs. We've got coming up Derby Adult Learning Service, looking at family support and how families can help with de-escalating children's behaviour. So we've had 30. I think we've actually got 14, so we've had to double up next Wednesday. So there's 14 different sessions. They have all been recorded, and hopefully at some point I'll be able to get them onto a platform to be shared for schools to use in their own settings in September. And then coupled with that, we've had the Tom Bennett training for senior leaders, head teachers, principals that happened in May, with a follow-up session this coming Thursday. That was fantastic. The Tom Bennett training, he's a DFE independent advisor, very, very passionate, very, very much around culture and ethos and changing behaviour policies and looking at the global picture across primary schools. And there was lots of positive feedback from that training. So what we tried to do is look at sort of some small takeaways and some strategy around ethos and culture. So that was stage 1. Moving on to stage 2 is again an intervention catalogue. So again, very similar to secondary. thinking about how there's all the different services out there that bringing them all together into one place on an intervention catalogue. That's coming together, and there'll be some more updates at HSLM in a couple of weeks time on that. And then into stage 3, the primary fair access protocol is something that is a legal document that we work towards, and looking at how we can manage moves, how we can look at behaviour support, and how we can support schools in a different way to what is currently happening. Whatever is in the protocol is what we can do in terms of in-year fair access. So there's been lots of conversations with lots of different schools about what Derby needs and how we can move that forward. So that's all in progress. So back to SEND in particular, and exclusions. So thinking about I'm just pausing. Were there any questions around the behaviour strategy?
So just one question. What is the difference between managed move and fresh start?
So in terms of secondary, there isn't a managed move as such anymore. That's paused. There is an admissions managed move in secondary, and that's where a parent is requesting to move their child from school A to school B. So for example, Landau to Murray Park, and that child has got a number of fixed term exclusions, has got some additional vulnerabilities. They would meet the criteria for admissions managed move, and because the parent has requested that move, we monitor that move through secondary placement panel, because the parent has a legal right to move their child, but it supports the new school moving forward, but also supports the child. And Genevieve Gordon would be the Specialist Education Welfare Officer, monitoring and supporting through that process. In terms of managed move in a primary setting, we haven't had any this year, and a school can ask for a managed move if a child moves from school to school, and we would see if that child meets that criteria through primary placement panel, which happens once a fortnight. Fresh starts are not in primary, they're just in secondary. Okay, so back to exclusions and back to SEND children.
Sorry, Ellen, can I just pause you just 1 second? There's been a few more questions come up.
Sorry.
One of them was okay, so would welcome some CPD training for staff at secondary level. Is this something that could be implemented? And
yes.
Can those training sessions also be opened up to post 16, please?
So something similar to what we've had in primary, but for secondary colleagues and post 16. Yeah, I can take that back to the working group, and we could definitely look at that if there's an appetite for that. That's good. And if anybody's got any suggestions about what in particular, my email address is on the first slide, and please drop me an email at any point.
And I think you've mentioned this, but if you could just sort of reiterate it again, are the recordings of the summer training programmes available? Yeah,
there's been a hitch, should we say. They are all recorded. I have them all in my user space, but because through GDPR and accessibility, I'm not allowed to share them until I've got the green light as such. So yes, they will be at some point, but I'm waiting for the go ahead with that. Hopefully schools will have those for September.
And one final question, could you confirm that it was called Admissions Manage Move?
Yeah, Admissions Manage Move in secondary, where a parent wants to move their child from one secondary school to another secondary school within Derby City, but that child has got a history of challenging behaviour. Usually a high number of fixed term exclusions is the main indicator for that criteria.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions so far. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So, so we're back to exclusions, we're back to SEND children, and how Michelle Wolverson and myself work together to try and reduce the number of exclusions for SEND children. So we monitor each exclusion. Every exclusion comes into in-year fair access email address. So we see that on a daily basis. We look at the names, we look at the schools, and if there's a pattern, we will liaise with the school. Like I said earlier, generally the parent who may be concerned will contact Michelle. Michelle's details are on the exclusion letter that goes home to parents. So if a parent does have any concerns, she's the sort of the first person that they'll go to, unless they've gone directly back to the school. So we do a lot of liaising and mediating sometimes between schools and parents, because sometimes that communication might have broken down for whatever reason, but we're available to be able to do that. We work closely with SENDIAS, so if there are children who got an education healthcare plans, and again, from a parent's perspective, the parent may contact SENDIAS, SENDIAS will contact myself or Michelle, and we'll work together to try and make sure that the young person or the child doesn't have any more exclusions, and they settle back into school, and we work at ensuring that their place is secure. If, however, things are rocky and things are not working, or if a school has applied for an education healthcare plan and not necessarily know what stage it's at, again, Michelle and I will work closely with the SEND officers and just try and provide that bridge that gap with that information back to the school. If it's a young person who's got an education healthcare plan and the school is finding it difficult to maintain that place, again, we will work with the SEND officers to share the information on the fixed term exclusions. Michelle will usually be liaising with the parents, so it's just joining all that together to ensure that child and that family is supported through the process. What we found this year is that the high number of Derbyshire residents, so if your school is on the border of Derby City, and the child that's been excluded actually lives in Derbyshire, they are they're able to tap into some different strategies and interventions through Derbyshire and what Derbyshire offer. Excuse me. So you may be aware that there's GRIP funding for Derbyshire residents. There's tailored support packages for Derbyshire residents. So it's definitely worth considering when there's a challenging child or young person that you've got and they've had a high number of exclusions. If they live in a Derbyshire postcode, we're aware of that because we check that anyway. But then we work quite closely with a lady called Claire Pacey, who is a SEND officer for Derbyshire, and we work to try and maintain that placement in the school, because ultimately if the child is then permanently excluded and they have a Derbyshire postcode, they go into Derbyshire Prue as opposed to Newton's Walk or Kingsmead. So we try and alert Claire and work with Claire quite closely at a very early stage to try and prevent the young person getting permanently excluded. And then finally, they're just informing social workers. So this is a piece of work that I've just done over the last few months, where we've used the at-risk register in primary, we've looked at the repeat exclusions in secondary, and if a child has a social worker, Michelle and I have contacted the social workers and just opened up dialogue around that child or that young person in terms of, this is what we know, this is how many exclusions they've had, or that they're red or amber on the at-risk register. We really want to try and work together to prevent a permanent exclusion later down the line, or prevent any further fixed terms, and how can we support you as a social worker to work with the school and work with the family. So it's just that collaborative approach to that child who's in the heart of the middle. Actually, I should have had the child in the middle of that piece of cake there. And then, I'm aware of time now, what also we've been looking at over this last few months is the children who are on reduced timetables. And the primary at-risk register is identifies children who are on a reduced timetable. Not necessarily how reduced. It could be an hour a day. It could be that they finish 15 minutes early. It's any child who is not in school full time. And I've only got data for primary currently, although I am collecting secondary data, ready for the secondary fair access panel meeting next week. So there's around 40 children in primary that are on a reduced timetable across the city. Different reasons, some COVID reasons, a lot of young children in reception, so they're obviously new to school but maybe missed out on that nursery, early years education from last year, and that extra transition into school that would have normally taken place in normal times. Some schools have got policies on reduced timetables, and I think it's good practice to have a policy to be able to review and to monitor the children that are on reduced timetables, because no child should be on a reduced timetable for indefinitely. So that review process is really, really key. And each school, each setting will have a dedicated time, so whether that's weekly, fortnightly, half-termly, and if that's in a policy, then the justification is there of why that child is on that reduced timetable. But whether it's primary or secondary, the parents need to be in agreement with that reduction in time, and depending on the age of the child or young person, that obviously they need to be in agreement with that too. What we've tried to do a little piece of work on in where we are in June is ready for secondary transition. So looking at the number of year 6 children who are on reduced timetables now, or have been throughout this year, and working closely with the secondary school that they're going to, so that the secondary school are aware that child might have been only on mornings only for whatever reason, and just sharing that information and making them understand how the impact of that will be in secondary when they're expected to attend full time, and working with the family around that too. And then linking in with the vulnerabilities, because if that child who's on a reduced timetable is on a child protection plan, or they're a looked after child, or a child in need plan, it's making sure that they're not more vulnerable not being in school, and having that risk assessment around that child to ensure that if they are only in for a short period of time during the day, what are they doing at other times during the day, and whose responsibility is that, and making sure that they're safe. So it's just joining together all of those pieces of that jigsaw, and that piece of work is ongoing at the moment. And then just finally, that there's nothing new on here, I don't think, apart from this, which I was just going to touch on. So support and intervention for primary SEND pupils. Obviously, you would use your graduated response in terms of supporting SEND children with behaviour concerns. But what we're doing through the behaviour strategy is we've developed a reintegration form following an exclusion that's got a question, have you tried, and a list of classroom interventions for children who might be red, amber or green on the at-risk register. And that reintegration form is just a pro forma. It can be adapted to any school or setting, and it's basically asking schools to think about, okay, the child was excluded, what needs to change for that child? Because if they're excluded for a day or 2 days, they come back. What schools don't want is to see a repeat of the same type of behaviour. So what is the school going to do differently? What's the child going to do differently? What are the parents going to do differently? So it's not all focused on schools. It could be down to parents saying, okay, I'm going to make sure that my child has breakfast before they come to school every day. I'm going to make sure they go to bed at 8 o'clock at night. So it's sensitive conversations that need to take place in that reintegration meeting, but further details on that will be shared at HSLM in a couple of weeks. Using the primary intervention catalogue to suggest other things to try. I've been involved in the PSN reviews. I know that was spoken about this morning, but that's about different schools working together to share examples and share good practice. It's a graduated response project that some schools are involved in, and some schools involved in the inclusion project. So I appreciate not every school in the city is involved, but there are different projects there that will help and support children to reduce exclusions, to improve behaviour, to improve their inclusive practice. And then there's behaviour support through Newton's Walk that's still accessible for Carol Schloss, who's excellent at providing support for individual children. So that service is still available currently. And then finally, in secondary, what support and intervention is available for SEND pupils? Most secondary schools have got internal alternative provisions, and some of those provisions are established, and some are very new, and some schools are thinking about introducing them for September. And they're designed to meet the needs of the children, to offer an alternative curriculum, to perhaps provide more therapy. All city schools have had the Thrive approach offered to them, so that most schools have got a Thrive licensed practitioner in post now, and through their internal alternative provision, that Thrive practitioner can do some real targeted intervention. There is the use of external alternative provision through Kingsmead and Derby Pride Academy, and again that links to the secondary intervention catalogue, because there are other alternative provisions that can be that come at a cost, that can be offered part-time, 1 day, 2 days a week, and then obviously the projects there at the bottom that are on offer to secondary schools too. Okay, I've whizzed through those last 2 slides, so I appreciate if anybody's got any questions, then please feel free.
Hi there. Okay, so there's just one last question. Do schools continue paying £15,000 per year if an excluded pupil leaves Kingsmead and is successfully reintegrated into a local mainstream school?
No, once the child or young person comes back into a mainstream school, they come back through secondary placement panel. They come back as a supported place, and they're monitored and have a period of 12 weeks. Once their new school signs them off, it sounds really awful, but once they're settled in their new school and they're successful, then they are signed off and they become on roll of their new school, and then the school that has permanently excluded stop paying at that point.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I'm just picking up on the comment there from Pauline, just to say that the Thrive approach was funded through the opportunity area, which was a fantastic opportunity. I'm actually halfway through the course, to move my course onto another one, and it's such a good course for practitioners to go on and to have that available, that option to be able to do that intensive work with young people in their schools is great for Derby schools.
Any final questions? Before you leave to go to the next session, please do fill the poll in. Okay, I've been asked to remind you about that. So yeah, do fill the poll in. That'd be fantastic. Thank you. And if there's no other questions, Ellen, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Interesting. Thank you.